Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the course overview of the final course from the Know Yourself program. So this is the flagship self-study program available from Make It Conscious, and the final course, course 5, is called The Way of Individuation. This is the longest course in the program, and this is where I go into the greatest depth into my 7 Habits of Individuation model. So you might be familiar with this model already if you've seen some of my older videos about that, or maybe you've downloaded the short primer from makeitconscious.com. This course, though, is where I go into the greatest depth into this model. Everything that I talk about here and think about more broadly can be slotted into this model somewhere. It's designed to be very comprehensive. Anything related to self-knowledge, which is everything, right? There's nothing outside of this endeavor. Whether it's relating to your career, pursuing material freedom, whether it's related to communication, whether it's related to meditation or active imagination, these things all play a role. It's certainly about taking responsibility, not least taking responsibility for your mind. So these are a series of practices, yes, but they're also, and moreover, a series of tools to help you think and reflect. They are tools for self-knowledge. There's nothing prescriptive here. There's nothing certainly absolutist about any of this. All of these are mere vehicles and ideas, born out of my own experience, but also born out of reading and studying and encounters with various people throughout the years, and also my reading of philosophy, psychology, mysticism, and so on. So I'm going to hand you over now to the very first lesson from course 5, a course overview, and hope you enjoy. So welcome back and to the Know Yourself program and to this next course, which is called The Way of Individuation. In this course, we're going to be looking at the 7 habits of individuation, and it's really the way of living life in such a way that leads to greater freedom. This really is the overarching method, if you like, of how to be yourself. Now, of course, how you be yourself, how I be myself, and anyone else is not a universal thing we can all ascribe to. This is definitely not about a list of do's and don'ts. It's much more than that. However, it's a series of principles that can be applied to this very process of individuation that anyone can apply and use in their own way. So it's a system, yes, but it's also a method of understanding. Pretty much everything I talk about can be aligned and mapped to the 7 habits model in some way or another. In fact, that's one of the key ways in which the 7 habits actually came about. It was like, how do I group together all the things I like to think about and talk about and that I write about in my diary on a near daily basis? What is the theme that's going on here? And over the course of many years, and of course, from studying different things, from studying spiritual traditions, from reading psychology, from putting these things in these lessons into practice in life, from building a business, from traveling around the world, and from building a business online, from my experiences in the corporate workplace and so on. What's this all leading to? And it's funny because I think the next slide is in fact a quote from Hegel. And he said himself that the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. And it's not just the history of the world, it's also our own history if we do it right. Because we are free inherently already. And so we're actually coming to discover ourselves, which means coming to discover our own freedom. The freedom to be ourselves, the freedom to live and experience life in line with what we need, to have our needs met, but also not imposing on the needs of others as well, because that naturally is a violation of freedom. So it's about becoming uncontradictory from another perspective, because what is freedom other than the lack of contradiction? As we've been discussing in previous courses, every other idea has some kind of contradiction to it. Freedom too actually has a kind of contradiction, And that is how it shows up in the form of evil in our world, right? It's a violation of freedom. But the only reason that exists is because one is free to do it. So at its essence, freedom is what there is. It is non-contradictoriness at its heart. And so becoming more free, becoming who we are, essentially means becoming uncontradicted in ourselves, which is exactly what individuation means. That's exactly what Carl Jung meant when he coined this phrase. It's sometimes said that we're not merely individuals, at least not by default. It might be more appropriate to call us dividuals. We are actually divided in ourselves. Also, there's good reason to become divided, kind of, right? There's a way in which we come to evolve that means having to put forward a certain thesis of ourselves, work with certain ideas, certain models of reality, but at the same time, using them as a way to keep moving forward. And so not getting attached to them, but letting them go when we need to. And moreover, continually revising and letting go of what doesn't work as we experience life. This is very much Hegel's dialectic. It's going out to the world, meeting something, testing our thesis, whether it's an idea, whether it's a method, whether it's an understanding of ourselves, and discovering what is true and what is not true. That's part of that. In fact, it's more about discovering what isn't true. It's about letting go of what isn't true and taking on board what we encounter in the world. So this is how we sublate into a high level understanding and greater sophistication, greater relationships with ourselves and with others. This is the process of individuation. This is Hegel's dialectic. This is the movement of spirit. And so this is not only how world history has been unfolding, and Hegel observed this in the early 1800s, and even then he was making that observation, and his theory has held true in that regard ever since, and seems like it will continue to. And there's very sound philosophical reasons for that. It comes down to the fact, as I said, that there is this inherent non-contradiction, but within that you have to have some contradiction. You have to have both, right? But at its essence, the essence itself is non-contradiction. So where we do have a contradiction of sorts, where we do have a mismatch between ourselves, within ourselves, or between ourselves and the world around us, we experience some kind of conflict. This shows up in the form of challenge, suffering, a misalignment with what is. We experience this in our conscious minds as a tension or as pain of some kind. And this compels us to actually do something about it. So this journey is very much about negating impositions on freedom, which come from both the external and the internal. And so in this modality, I'm going to be talking about ways of addressing both of those areas. At its whole, these are all internally generated by the self and by spirit itself. So in some curious, mysterious way, what we encounter in the world is in some ways a reflection of ourselves, but not entirely, because there's no absolutism here. There's no one-sidedness here. And understanding where that starts and ends is a very useful exercise, or at least trying to inquire into that. But overall, the 7 habits are how we deal with those things. They are, in Hegelian terms, how we negate negation. Now, anything in this world that is useful, whether it be a religion, whether it be a spiritual technique or practice or tradition, whether it be a scientific theory, whether it be a philosophy, a way of life, all of these things are useful to an extent. They serve some kind of purpose. And so all of these things serve to negate negation to an extent. They serve as a level or a model that can be used for some time. And they're useful insofar as they do that, but then they start to break down where they cease to do that. So problems arise when we attach to any particular model and think, okay, this is the way forward. This is the religion. This is the God. This is the one true, absolute truth. And this gives rise to all the problems we can observe in our world, pretty much. So whether it's within a religion, whether it's between religions, whether it's between religion and materialist science, whether it's between materialist science and humanitarianism, or those who say, hang on a second, there's more about the mind here that we can't explain, whether it's within those who want to use mysticism as a way to negate other people or to violate the freedom of other people. So this is the reason why there's conflict between these things, because they're all useful to an extent, and they're all containing falsity to an extent. So this should be approached with much the same attitude, right? It's to understand that this is yet another map, yet another model. However, I've done my best to make it a model that, to the farthest extent possible, accounts for these facts within it. And so it is there to be understood, to be used as you need to, because it's always about your own freedom. That's what this entire process is about. That's all it ever can be. Even when you're dabbling with a model and a theory, whether or not you know it, you are still doing that, hopefully in service of your own gradual progress towards your own freedom and awareness of yourself. But if you know that that's what you're doing, great. But it's hard to know that that's what you're doing until you've tried a few things out and seen where they go wrong and seen where they fall apart. And not least, by the way, where we exist in a time or a culture where it's been indoctrinated into us pretty much that there is no other way than the way, that all we need to do is find that one set of rules or values that's subjectively best for everyone. If we can just figure that out, then we'll figure our minds out. We won't have to go anywhere, right? We can just control our well-being through just the right strategy. But no matter where we attempt this in life, it always falls down. No matter whether it's in spirituality, whether it's in business, whether it's in science. And luckily, that implicit knowledge is, to an extent, built into the substructure of our society. It's the reason we have a society, frankly. It's that we have this ability to negate negation. Even if we don't know what it is we're actually doing, it's happening anyway. But in order for spirit to realize itself, we must realize it ourselves. We must be part of this overall unfolding. Then we can actually know we can facilitate it consciously. So understanding this very phenomenon, this very movement of mind, is a key part of coming to understand ourselves, because we are mind. It becomes quite iterative. And so understanding the very process itself is in some sense like a key part of coming to the very end of the process, as Hegel emphasized towards the end of his career. But in reaching the end, we might realize that the end is the beginning is the end, and the process is what there is. So it gets a bit, we don't need to go there right now. We're just going to keep it quite practical and move on to a quote from Jung. So what actually is then individuation from the man who coined the phrase? Well, it's captured quite concisely in this quote from him, where he said that the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. So I think here he's talking about two key components of a psychological journey. And there's more to his words than he lets on here. So firstly, divesting the self of the persona. The persona, of course, being a word for mask. That's what the ancient Greeks used to call the mask, which they would use in theatre. And so the persona in the psychological sense is the way we present ourselves, the way we like to be shown, or the way we like to be seen in the world, the way we like to show up. And that also implies that there's a kind of energy involved in that. There's a kind of energetic commitment to an image of self. And therefore, there's resistance to not being that way. So firstly, we have something useful in the persona because it helps us navigate as a known self within an unknown sea of not self. I mean, how on earth do you possibly deal with the fact that there's things you don't know? Well, isn't there a challenge? Okay, well, the way you do it is you identify with a thesis. You postulate yourself as a way to account for what you don't know. Well, I don't know what's around the corner, but I know that if it's this kind of thing, I can respond to it in this way. I don't know what the party tonight's going to be like, but if I show up in this way, maybe I can retain some control and influence over what I don't know. So the persona is a way of doing that, and it's born largely in early experience, but the formation of the persona and its opposite, the shadow, or at least in part its opposite, is formed through experience, and it's happening all the time, especially when we don't realize what we're doing here. For as long as we subscribe to the view that there is a right and wrong way of doing something in a sort of pragmatic sense, and that there is this one right way, then we will always be undergoing this process of persona shadow formation to some extent. However, that belief is perhaps no stronger than when we are a baby. It's not a conscious belief. If anything, it's more of an adaptation to the reality that we're dealt with at that time. The fact that we have not differentiated from whence we've came, from the oceanic sea of the unconscious. And so, not least, that all the influences that impinge upon us have a very, very great impact at that time. They have a great influence on the unconscious mind, whether it be through some mechanistic neuronal sense, the shaping of our brain, perhaps, or in a more intangible sense, maybe even through a kind of spiritual sense where the very way we form is a manifestation of the world around us. It is being willed by that which is not our own conscious will, at least. Certainly the will of our parents and the will of society at large, through which they are a conduit. But then we start to go to, nursery and then school, and there's all these other kids around, and there's caregivers, and each of them exerts a will on us, and we adapt through that. But what does that mean? Well, it means that we use some kind of guide as a way to understand what is and isn't conducive to our existence and our becoming. And at such an age, the best guide we have for that, the only guide we have for that pretty much, is pleasure and pain. So we tend to move towards what feels good. We tend to move away from what is painful, understandably. This is the body's way of creating a proxy, a pretty useful proxy, largely, for what is and isn't conducive to survival. But then at some point, we start to realize that it's a bit more complicated than that, and that our mind has an involvement too. And so we start to develop meaning from such experiences. We learn to be certain ways and not others. And at some point, we may even not just learn to be how our parents wanted us, but we may do precisely the opposite. We may actually deliberately, or at least in reaction to how we're treated by our parents and how we really feel that they're responding to us, we may well reject their wishes for us and their explicit or implicit desires for us. So we rebel, maybe even at a very, very early age. This may well be a very natural reaction, and the parents may kid themselves that this is just an unruly child and there's nothing more to it than that. And it may well have some grounding in the fact that this child maybe we just wanted something. We wanted that cake, or we wanted those sweets, or whatever it was. We wanted that toy off the other kid. So we just went and grabbed it because we're moving towards pleasure as far as we're concerned. We're getting involved in that very early stage master-slave dynamic. So it's entirely possible that we not only do what our parents want and adopt a persona that way, but actually we vehemently rebel against it. Either way, it sets up this dynamic of the persona and the shadow. So there's an energetic element to this. It's all about energy. It's all about a thesis versus an antithesis. And that serves us to some degree for quite some time, in varying degrees. No doubt we create problems, but unless we're really forced to physically in our young lives, we're likely to externalize those negative effects and assume that they are entirely to do with other people's choices. If we become disciplined by a caregiver or a teacher or something, well, at that point, you might actually decide, yeah, it's probably best that I don't snatch that thing from the other kid's hands or be aggressive with that other kid. And so we learn this way. We don't want to be punished. But this is still an externalization of something. It's an externalization of authority. There's a presumption that it's those outside of me that really know what's up, that really know how to live. And that may well be true, and it usually is true as a young child. Problem is, it's still largely true for a lot of adults. And when you have such adults leading those children, it's questionable how much better that really is. It's clearly better than just being on a rampage. Some rules are generally better than no rules, as I sometimes say, as was the case with some rudimentary forms of religion, thou shalt not sort of thing. Well, at least that's better than just going and smacking people over the head and taking their land, generally speaking. So that's how we have to operate. And this sets up this dynamic, and there's energy associated with that, and there's resistance to that. But beyond the personal existence and the personal unconscious, there's also the archetypal existence. So there's the power of archetypes. So individuation is not merely coming to terms with our own existence and what is fully within our control and what is fully created by our own history, and really reconciling with that. There's this whole other side to individuation as well, which is coming to terms with that which is beyond ourselves, which is part of the human, like the Akashic record, if you like, the collective unconscious, the objective psyche. Everything that is outside of ourselves and will pretty much forever be outside of ourselves as an individual. So we cannot control these facets of humanity. We cannot control other people. We can certainly influence our own mind, and we can, to an extent, control our own mind. But you see, these things are part of our own mind. They are part of the psyche, and we get to actually influence our relationship to them. And none of the objective psyche by itself is bad, as it were. Every archetype has both wholesome and unwholesome qualities, or positive and negative qualities. It can present itself in a very friendly and collaborative form, or a daemonic, resistant form, largely by virtue of our own meaning that we associate with it, the way we relate to it, and how we approach it. If we approach it like appearing kind and appearing friendly, but inside we're actually not feeling that way, it will show us our hypocrisy. So there's also a place here for actually cultivating a relationship with the objective psyche, including, as I mentioned, there's no inherently negative side to it, but there is the archetypal shadow, that which is difficult to confront in mind itself. So here we have a very curious challenge, and this was what the previous course was all about. So I won't go into huge detail here, but there's some form of reconciliation that must occur with evil itself. It's not a justification, it's not an excuse, it's not a bypass, it's actually completely the opposite. It is confronting it, and that, of course, means confronting it in ourselves. That's part of what inner shadow work is about. It's part of what individuation is about. And it also means coming to terms with the reality of evil in the world and being honest and realistic about its existence and what can be done about it, understanding that our own side is a key part of that, but also recognizing the free will of others as well, and what we are to do about that. So that's a Jungian take on the process of becoming who we really are. And yes, it means making the unconscious conscious, which is what all spiritual traditions have endeavored to do, really. And it also means, on a similar note, deepening a relationship with the unconscious. So, to that end, the three aims of this course. One is to understand the process and the conditions for self-knowledge. What does it actually involve? What do we actually do about this predicament we find ourselves in? And what are some practical techniques and tips we can apply to actually move ourselves towards greater self-knowledge? Two, to gain a practical understanding of the 7 habits of individuation. As I've mentioned, whilst they are, one, very practical, something you can do. Two, tools to think and understand. And three, they are a system for collating much of the things that I like to think about and that I think are related to this overall task. They are a way of bringing together a lot of disparate ideas and finding the common theme to them, which is this pursuit of freedom and self-knowledge. So we're going to be taking a very practical approach in this course. Three, understand how you can improve your own journey towards freedom, greater self-knowledge, and spiritual development, if you want to call it that. As I've discussed in previous modules, especially in course 1, I would say that what we call spiritual developments and self-knowledge are largely synonymous. However, I'd say that the idea of spiritual growth is a bit of a tricky one because it's somewhat nebulous and doesn't really explicitly explain to a lot of people, I think, what it really involves. And on the contrary, can actually sound a bit tantalizing. And that's not really what we're looking for here, because we're not looking to just identify with a spiritual persona. This is a large part of the problem that this very much addresses. It's, you are seeking self-knowledge. If you understand yourself, that's it, right? That's all we're here to do. Where the self starts and ends is another topic, and I'll leave that deliberately open-ended. That's for you to inquire into. So a lot of the problem, I think, overall is that we rely on spirit and the external world to impose our path to progress. And the 7 habits are really about understanding that there is a process and what spirit is moving towards and aligning ourselves with that overall process. So it is a series of tools, techniques, and understandings for aligning ourselves with what is. And as I mentioned, in Hegelian terms, it's how we sublate our conflicts. When you begin putting this into practice, and to a large extent, you probably already are, you notice new challenges arise. So this can be a bit counterintuitive. It's like, I thought I was doing things in a way that was in more alignment with spirit and myself and what there is. Why am I encountering more challenges? Well, because you're noticing them for a start, and because you're manifesting them, because they're appearing now, because there are opportunities for you to negate negation, to resolve conflict you might experience, to reflect back areas of yourself that might be in conflict between the way you used to be and the way you aspire to be, between what worked in the past and what would be a more holistic, self-realized approach going forward. So that brings us to the end of this very first lesson. I hope you found it informative. Hope you're keen to get started. So I shall see you in module 0, which is called Individuation is a Way of Life. That brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed it, then please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I always appreciate ratings and reviews as well. For the Know Yourself program, simply head over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.